think it's called a complexity science, that requires that there's a critical threshold that's reached before something snowballs, right? Before it becomes widespread behavior. But yeah, you're right. The story has to exist before that happens, usually for a long time.
But the records of the earlier, at least recorded from what we know, is this guy Pictor to the early 3rd century BC, and Mark Cato the Elder also to the maybe mid 3rd century BC. Those are the ones who write about the Aeneas, and that's actually the sources that Virgil used.
Yeah, well, so what happened was in approximately the 3rd century, the Greeks, the Romans were expanding in Italy, and they started once again more intensively interacting with the Greek cities in southern Italy in Magna Graecia. There was an impetus for all of these stories to get systematized. And that was the influence of the Greeks, because the Greeks systematized all their stories and made them consistent and tried to put them together and created genealogies and so forth and so on. So the form of these stories in many cases is late, but there were stories before that which didn't have the same cut and dry and let's say Greek-centric view as, for example, the Aeneas story.
By the way, Emilia, do you have a map to show where Lavinium and Alba Longa in relationship to Rome?
No. I only have the Word document, but at this time, the area was populated by Etruscans, Latins, Italics, Celts to the north, and the Sabines, with the Sabines and the Italics being the closest to the nascent Romans, and the Etruscans being a little bit around into the north. They would not have had contact with the Celts until much later. Right. So then, but yeah, moving forward on this. So Ascanius ascended to the throne.
Excuse me, could I ask a question? Excuse me, could I ask a question? You see, this document it's impossible to read anything. It's absolutely kind of, is it possible to do, for example, word window, yes, like this? Okay, thank you very much, because before that it
you
was,
can, yeah.
okay, thank you. Maybe
you can,
more bigger.
Yeah, you can zoom in Zoom, you can zoom your view. You look at view options.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So he did not like Lavinium, and he moved the capital to Alba Longa. And usually, as we have seen in history, when a ruler moves the capital, it's because either there's a threat to his life or power in the existing capital, or he simply wants to establish a separate power base. Well, as a result of those reasons, right? Louis XIV moved the capital to Versailles to rein in the nobles that had too much power in their local areas. Sargon also moved his capital, and Akhenaten also moved the capital to try to consolidate power. Again, this is myth, but perhaps there's an ancestral memory. So the name Alba Longa means long white, and it's probably due to the spread of the village along the Alban Lake. Then generations later, one of Aeneas's descendants, Procca, left the kingdom to he had two kids. The eldest one, Numitor, inherited the throne, and the treasury was given to Amulius, and who eventually deposed Numitor, but presumably, given the rest of the story, he probably used a lot of the money to grease the wheels, if you will. So we can, assuming that this is true, right? We can just logically think, okay, Numitor must not have been very popular, otherwise he would have had wider support. And Amulius would have had to tip the elites to his side to overthrow Numitor. It's unlikely that a bunch of, at this point they were villagers, would rebel against the elites. So he would have had the elites on his side. No one rallied to Numitor's cause, and that speaks volumes. Then he had Numitor's son Augustus murdered and made his daughter Rhea Silvia a Vestal Virgin. We can assume that she was, you know, a woman, girl like any other. Maybe she had a boyfriend, maybe whatever. But anyway, she became pregnant and claimed to be raped by Mars, the god Ares in the Greek pantheon, which is, it's also a foreshadowing of the kind of children that she's going to have, right? They were violent people. Well, in a violent world. Let's also underscore it with that.
Can I add something here? You know, the Vestal virgins, they were supposed to be virgins, and
Yes.
Actually the punishment for losing virginity was the death in a very horrible way. They were buried alive, basically. So I mean, no wonder she would come up with an idea that was a god who had. I mean, that's my interpretation of it.
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, you have to go for broke at that point. But that you raise a good point, because so we can imagine, obviously you kill the son because he poses a greater threat, and then he made the daughter a permanent virgin to make sure that she does not give birth to children that could potentially challenge his claim on power. So she gave birth to the twins Romulus and Remus, and then the sources are unclear as to whether she was killed by Amulius. In some stories, she was, as you say, buried alive. In others, Amulius's daughter intervened, and she lived. Amulius's daughter intervened on Rhea Silvia's behalf, and she was spared. The twins were left to drown by the Tiber. Again, like, this seems a little odd. Normally, you would just kill the twins. Why would you leave it to fate? But again, this is part of the myth. So they were rescued and raised. This is where it gets interesting. They were rescued and raised by a shepherd, Faustulus, and his wife, Acca Larentia. Now, there are contradictions to this story. In some stories, it was a lupa, which was slang for whore, so a prostitute, and she was a different person, a different woman from Acca Larentia. In others, they conflate the lupa with Acca Larentia. But if we can imagine that they were two kids, likely born and raised by a woman who was a prostitute and the man that married her, they had 11 other sons. So they basically raised 13 children, and then those kids proceeded to form a gang that robbed, beat up, and murdered herdsmen, merchants, passerby. They were, you know, I mean, does the apple fall far from the tree? It shows an interesting, again, ancestral memory. So I would posit that this casts doubt on the claim that the twins were of royal blood, and in fact were, you know, even brothers maybe. Who knows? Maybe they were just criminal buddies that refer to each other the same way that today's do. Oh, hey, he's my brother. Who's my brother? Because this will play later on into how easily Romulus kills Remus. If he's your actual blood genetic brother, it's a little difficult, right? I mean, not even Amulius killed the Numitor, but yet Romulus had no problem killing Remus.
You know,
so perhaps their lineage was made up after the fact to grant them legitimacy or some sort of royal lineage. It's common. It's been done for important figures throughout history. You don't want to say, hey, we're descended from the son of a prostitute and who was a murderer and a brigand. You know, it does not have the same cachet as saying we were descended from royalty.
Let me just say that if we're saying that Romulus and Remus were legendary figures, and I believe they were, I don't know that it's really fruitful to say, well, you know, if it was real, maybe, you know, maybe they tried to explain this and complain that. I mean, if they're myths, then you have to think about them and interpret them from a mythic point of view. So you could talk about what purpose does this aspect of the myth serve? But I don't know that it makes sense to just come in and say, okay, all of a sudden say, well, you know, let's assume that they were real, and then start, saying, well, in that case, what can we, suppose about it? Because the odds are very good that they didn't exist at all.
You raise a good point, Paul, and the reason I think that it is important to talk about them as if they were in some way real is because if they were simply made up whole cloth, why would anyone go through the trouble of explaining, trying to explain away this criminal or negative past? You would simply just say they were princes and were descended from these illustrious men.
I can answer that.
Also,
I can answer that. The reason is that you see this all throughout the stories of the founding of Rome. Rome was formed as being a sanctuary for all sorts of unsavory people, slaves, criminals, fugitives, refugees of different types. So to the extent that there is a memory in there, it's a memory of that Rome started from very humble beginnings and was accepting people who had been rejected from all sorts of other communities.
Yes, this is 100% true, and someone would have had to found Rome and organize them, and in no likelihood, at least in my view, it would not have been an upstanding citizen from
Sure.
or a successful citizen from another village, because then there would not have been any reason for this person to leave his high status to establish a town essentially of criminals. So there must have been some sort of criminal founder that essentially then created a community for them, and I would imagine that then over time that became Romulus and Remus.
Yeah, and I would add that it's not really very difficult to understand why there is later attempts to rationalize the story and try to clean it up and try to give them royal roots. That there was this, as I said, this reevaluation of the Roman myths as they came in contact with the Greeks, in the 3rd century, and started saying, well, we've got to kind of get our house into order. We've got to get our shit together because, we're exposed to this world where everything seems to make more logical sense. So there was an impetus to do that and clean things up and enable, the Romans to avoid embarrassment. So when you find things like this, that would seem to argue against what later apologists were trying to do, that's a real clue to history.
Precisely, and it actually, there is, I don't think it's been settled, a debate as to whether Rome was an outgrowth of the Etruscan city of Veii, or were they Sabines, or were they, so nobody really knows. But they do have, for example, with their Pomerium, they do have Etruscan religious rites, which were derived from Greek influences in their founding myths, which I think lends credence to the fact that they were more influenced by the Etruscans than any other people in Italy at that time. So then the myth goes on to say that then the gang grew. Obviously, their predations became more bold, if you will. Remus was captured and brought before Numitor. Now the story says he recognized him as his grandson and so on and so forth. But the salient point is that then he immediately thought, okay, hey, maybe I can use these guys to overthrow Amulius. I would think that the interpretation is he captured the local criminal leader, dangerous guy, and then he made a deal with him to help him depose Amulius. Remember, we're not dealing with cities proper here. These are really more like big towns. And if you have defenses, in all likelihood, unless you're Etruscan, you're going to have like palisade walls. These are things that, you can overcome them relatively easily in comparison to something like Veii. Okay, so then they killed Amulius and his sons. Numenor regained the throne of Alba Longa, and then this gave Romulus and Remus the idea to found a city of their own. That way you have a power base instead of just being a local gang. Numitor, glad to be rid of what I think were his mercenaries. He gave them money, supplies, and as Greg mentioned, the undesirable people that he wanted out of Alba Longa. So you're having likely debtors, criminals, people that you want out, which is going to have an interesting effect later on, because as Paul, as you said, Rome was a haven for the undesirables. This would have the effect of making wherever those people left safer, but also concentrating really dangerous people in one town. So they chose the site of the Tiber River, site by the Tiber River to settle, and then they basically set up separate power bases, splitting up tasks for farming, building walls, just creating a town, basically. And you could land grab because the populations were small, so they could just pick an area and settle in. So you can think of it as the USA in the 17 and 1800s. You could pretty much just go out and grab land or take it from locals if you could overpower them. So, however, only one could lead, and that obviously Romulus really wanted that. I'm sure Remus did too, but that led them into a conflict. So the myth says they went to Numitor, who didn't want to get involved by siding with one or the other in case, you see the writing on the wall that they're going to fight each other. You don't want to be on the losing side. So he told them, ask the gods, and that's where we get the famous story of the vultures. Remus says he saw 6 vultures flying over the hill that he sat on. I think it was the Capitoline, no, the Aventine. And Romulus then said that he saw 12, and he was in the Palatine. And so we have a primacy of arrival, which would be Remus, versus primacy of numbers, which is Romulus. I mean, it doesn't stretch the imagination to think that Romulus simply just made it up. And then, so then he killed, they got into an argument, and then later on, as they were building walls and defenses, Remus said, like, your defenses are weak, anyone can jump them. And then Romulus stated, well, if anyone jumps them, I'll kill him. And Remus jumped over, and then either Romulus or one of his henchmen killed Remus. So once the threat was dealt with, Romulus did the usual thing that elites have always done, which is he fake fawned and gave an amazing eulogy about what an awesome guy Remus was, how he was a hero. He made a holiday for him. It's like pretty standard ruler 101 to quell dissent or blow smoke up the recipient's butt in lieu of, I don't know why I added this, in lieu of paying him money or giving him power. Words cost nothing. It's a time-tested tradition. It's alive and well. I think Napoleon gave out medals and created like little, whatever. So it's pretty standard. This is actually going to be followed, as people learn, by Romulus's elites when they kill him, and then they say, wow, he was actually an amazing guy. He became a god. He's Quirinius. So people learn. Anyway, so then once that was done, Romulus summoned. Oh yeah, and also if he was his brother, it would be. It beggars belief to think that he simply just killed him so easily. So to me, this would suggest that he was only his brother of association and not his actual blood brother. Anyway, that's just my speculation. Romulus summoned Etrurian priests. The Etruscans were the premier people in Italy. There were 12 towns. They had an Etruscan league. They were very advanced, and Veii was the richest one, along with Tarquinia. They performed the Etruscan rites, establishing the Primarium. And then that way, this also lends credence to Rome being an offshoot of the Etrurian cities. Rome was purportedly founded in 753 BC, although this is open to interpretation and highly unlikely, because I think this only came into being after when they were fighting Carthage, and they were trying to establish that they were founded before Carthage. So in order to attract people,
can I say something? Well,
sure.
They may have, but actually Carthage was founded in 825 BC, supposedly. So 753 wouldn't do it. They would still be.
I stand corrected. Thank you. I don't remember where I got that. Maybe it was one of them. Maybe it was the Etruscans. I don't know. But you're right. If since Carthage was founded, then that was not the source of the founding date.
As far as archaeology is concerned, is that the first settlement on the site of the contemporary Rome was on the Palatine Hill. So it's kind of like supports the story that's where it started. The settlement was related to about maybe 9th century BC, and later on in the 8th and 7th centuries, they actually found what they believed was the Vestal temple of the Vestal Virgins with 6 beds, because we now scientists believe that there were 6 Vestal Virgins that was part of this structure of this temple.
Yes, you're right. The settlements predate the founding of Rome. They do have a lot of archaeological findings that are dated before 753 BC. So and as Paul said, these legends were floating around for a while before they actually coalesced. So perhaps that's the source, and perhaps it goes back to 900 or older, and that would make sense. So in order to attract people, he offered sanctuary to all individuals who wanted a fresh start. Obviously, like, you know, if say some new little country offers individual sanctuary, it's not going to be Bill Gates and Elon Musk that leaves. It's going to be debtors, criminals, the poor, you know, the people that are basically at the bottom of each village hierarchy. Most of them were male, if not all of them, or no. Which is good for intimidating rival villages, because you're gathering all these dangerous people in one area, but not so great for surviving past one generation, because obviously they're mostly male. So this is interesting. According to Dionysius,
let me just push back on the question that they were dangerous. You know, the fact that they didn't fit into the societies that they came from doesn't mean that they were bad, evil, antisocial people.
No, you're right. But the point being, if they have a significant number of criminals, for example.
Yeah, but what is the criminal? A criminal in those days was somebody that got on the wrong side of somebody with a lot of power. It doesn't mean that they were, you know, a criminal as we would think of it today in a society with laws and policing and norms. It's very easy to be made a criminal, you know, without, in fact, you know, being what we would call a criminal in modern parlance.
Well, I think that has evolved. I mean, it's a little different today. No, I think the threat remains the same. So, for example, let's say you get on the wrong side of groupthink today. Well, you can kiss your ability to pay your bills and your job goodbye. So what does that say about us today? Back then, sure, you could cross somebody powerful, but at the same token, that would be likely a similar percentage of the people that are marginalized today, right? You're not going to have a village of, say, 10,000 people, and 300 of them are going to get on the bad side of somebody rich, because pretty soon you're not going to have a village population. So I would imagine that those percentages hold relatively steady throughout history. But then again, this is my speculation. This is just my speculation. I could be completely wrong. So, and the other, I guess, analysis, that induction is that if criminals constitute a large enough percentage of the population, they will run the show simply because of the force of their personalities, right? So that's going to percolate to the rest of the people, and the behaviors are going to become more normalized. We can observe that today as well. Let's not go into that, but we can observe behaviors becoming that were unacceptable 20 years ago are now acceptable now because of percolation. Okay, so according to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Romulus then put forth to the people whether they wanted a monarchy, democracy, or oligarchy. I would imagine there were plants in the crowd because he just killed Remus. He's not going to leave it to chance to see whether people are going to rule Rome themselves or somebody else. So likely his plans shouted monarchy, and if they are criminals or if they are intimidating, but the rest are going to go along with it. So by public acclaim, he could claim he was monarch. Now this is obviously a lot of things are attributed to Romulus, but I think that's a shorthand. It's likely many people over many decades creating this. But just like you did say, like who won the Revolutionary War, George Washington, and people are gonna forget all the other generals and their names. Romulus became a catch-all. So who created the calendar? Romulus. Who created the census? Romulus. Who created the senators? Romulus. The equestrians? Romulus. Lichter's Romulus. So he becomes a catch-all for everything. But he selected a cast of 100.
Can I jump in there for a minute before we move on to the next topic?
Sure.
Is this
Sure.
okay? So first of all, in the biggest sense, Theodor Mommsen, who is the historian who basically created a scientific study of Rome in the 19th century, he pointed out, and it was still accepted as true by scholars, that when you look at these ancient records, that where you find discussions of ancient institutions, you actually can see that they have historical validity. When they talk about individuals, that's not the case. So what you do is you look for descriptions of institutions that continue to exist, and you will find evidence of different types that confirms that they exist, and you separate that from the individuals. So if we look at this comment by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, he's a Greek, and the Greeks are putting a Greek spin on everything when they look at Roman history. Everything is Greek-centric when you read a Greek historian. And what he's noticing here is that the early kings of Rome were fundamentally similar to Greek tyrants. And what that means specifically is that they had popular support, and that in fact they represented a resistance to aristocratic rule by individuals that were essentially championing the rights of those people outside of the aristocracy. So this idea of the crowd shouting for a monarch pretty much exactly explains the institution of tyrants, which happened in Greece in the 7th century and in the 6th century, and apparently happened at Rome as well. That's what this is really a description of. That the Roman kings were tyrants in the Greek sense. They were not aristocrats. They were actually in opposition to the aristocrats. They were outsiders.
Excellent point. And yeah, then he proceeded to create, and this is where it gets a little out, 100 high caste families, which then become the aristocratic class, the senatorial class.
He didn't create them. They existed. I mean, you didn't have to create what already existed. So the organization of the people at this point in time was around affluent and powerful individuals, householders, or you might say if they get very big, you'd call them warlords. But this was the traditional aristocracy. They existed before this. You may give them a name, but you didn't create them.
What we're looking at, or I guess what I'm basing this off of, is a mix of trying to thread the needle between what the myth says, which is likely exaggerated, distorted, with maybe some grain of truth, and how those are supposed to provide a foundation for existing institutions. So sure, there could have been elites, and in all likelihood there elites form naturally in any hierarchy, or rather in any group, right? You create a village, you're going to have an elite. So this would be a backstory explaining the highest caste families. The point here being, these would be highest caste relative to the rest of the population, because if we're looking at Rome as a collection of outcasts, then these would be the most respectable of disreputable people, at least by the standards of their own communities, which they left, right? Because again, we can't dismiss the fact that if they were highly esteemed in their own communities, they would never have left to go to Rome. It simply would not make sense. So
this already happened. Excuse me. This already happened after they were joined by Sabians, right? You know, you're going to talk about this, the Sabians?
This is still just the Albans. This is still just the Albans. So he has his own gang, and then he just got people from Alba Longa. The Sabines will come later when he fights. I believe it's Titus Tatius. So this served as the basis of the clientela system, which is basically, as Paul was saying, the gangs organized around the leader. So if we look at the story of Fabius's 300, maybe based off the Leonidas story, it was basically Fabius's gang. He was the pater, which is the head, the father, and the plebs or lesser nobles would be his cronies. So basically,
Emilio,
yeah.
Just a comment on sort of migration. I've studied some modern migration theory, international migration theory, and you're quite correct. Even today, the theory is that the elite do not migrate. They're very happy where they are. They like to be powerful, and anytime you migrate, you're going to be downwardly mobile. It's hard to start out a new life in a new society and new culture. On the other hand, the poor are unlikely to migrate. They just can't afford it. I mean, they're living on the edge of subsistence, and it's going to take a while to get established in any new place you move to. So the people who tend to migrate are sort of the middle classes, people who are upwardly mobile or who want to be, who are sort of, who have some resources with which to leave their society and establish themselves in a new society. And these are young, tend to be young and brave, adventurous, ambitious people. So it's the middle class. In fact, there's a theory called the migration hump, where as a society develops, more and more people migrate. It's not the poorest country. It's not people from the poorest countries or the poorest communities who tend to migrate. It's people from sort of middling communities where they have young, ambitious, upwardly mobile people with some resources. Those are the people who move. And that's modern migration theory, which might be applicable here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, let me just comment on, I think you said the key thing when you said it's a modern migration theory, that the context in which this is happening is a world in which there are central governments. And this, what we're discussing here, is a world in which there were no central governments. There were not even city-states at this really extreme beginning of this situation. So you had a society that was still primarily organized around these clans and around strong, pater. And later in Rome, they have the notion of the pater familias, the head of the family, who has life and death control over everybody in his house. That's what we're talking about here. Groups of people who were affiliated, a head of a family, and people that were family members, and slaves and servants and other sorts of dependents, and they existed before the cities did. So they could move as groups. And the example that Emilio gives of the Fabii 300 is a really good example, where the clan of the Fabii had a private army and carried on a private war against an Etruscan city. You have a similar story of Appius Claudius, who who joined the Roman Republic and brought in essentially a private army, his own group of followers, and was immediately given patrician status and became a consul in the next year. So the context was very different, and it really was the real question is, what's the process by which you move from having these clan-based structures into having a city-state, where the clans still exist, but they've been somehow subordinated to a notion of citizenship.
Yeah, and I think that it's basically just a factor of time and coalescing and letting essentially whatever culture pops up over time unite various disparate groups, because obviously the Romans were made up of a lot of different villages. Yeah, so then he created the Lichters, Assemblies. Now this is interesting. He empowered the people to vote on judges, laws, declarations of war, but the rich, the elite, they were the only ones allowed to hold high office, like priesthoods, for example. So what he gave the people were the ability to choose between one elite or another ruling them. So it seems like it was more an illusion of choice than an actual choice. Is it familiar today? Who knows? Probably. So Rome was basically a haven for the dregs of each surrounding village, and this made other villages look down on them, arguably for valid reasons, and they were refused political alliances and marriage treaties. No fathers wanted to marry their daughters to, criminals and living in a criminal town, or debtors, or unsavory characters, and leaders of other villages would presumably imagine, well, these guys have a very, very bad track record. There are some pretty interesting people here, so probably political alliances with them would not be ideal and would not reflect well on us. So then he needed alliances with neighboring villages. I mean, they're called kingdoms, but frankly, they're probably just small towns. The Albans, Ladins, Sabines, these are people. They have many towns. So Alban is a catch-all term, Latin is a catch-all term, so is Sabine. Again, Rome was seen as a collection of less than ideal characters, so people said no. And also, again, going to the founder, I mean, the son of a prostitute has started his career by stealing and murdering many, including his own brother, and surrounded himself with the absolute truck of society. Maybe this is not the best person to form an alliance with, right? If he kills his own brother, he's likely going to stab me in the back. And as we're going to see, he does exactly that with the people that form alliances with him. So Rome needed women. No one wanted to establish marriage alliances with them. Just like today, you wouldn't want your daughter marrying a drug dealer, a murderer, or a thief. So the same thing held back then. So what did he do? The Romans set up a trap. He sent out messages to villages like Canina and Temnae, Christomerium, Fidenae, Cures, and others, saying that he found an altar to a god and he was going to set up games to celebrate this. So the Sabines and Latins came, surely others did, but at least in the records, in the book that I read, the Sabines and Latins were the primary attendees. And so they likely figured, all right, this could be entertainment, and if they try anything underhanded, we have a bunch of towns, we'll just wipe them out. Romulus instructed his men to be armed and then spread them out over the visitors. And then at the shouting of Thalassius, they seized the females and forced the men to retreat, because obviously they didn't have weapons. So there's a Roman custom of shouting Thalassius at weddings, in addition to carrying the bride across the house entrance to simulate the kidnapping. And the theory is that, or the speculation is that this is where it originated. The numbers vary. They kidnapped anywhere from 30 to 680 women. Frankly, they just kidnapped women. We really don't know how many. Romulus supposedly married Hersilia, a Sabine noblewoman, and the cities of Canina and Temnae and Christomerium were heavily affected and would wage a war with Rome over the next few years, trying to enlist the help of Sabine cities, including Cures, which was ruled by Titus Tatius. But Titus Tatius and the Sabines delayed in helping these three cities, and likely for strategic reasons. I mean, I'm sure he thought that he could take the Romans out. I mean, the Sabines were a collection of people. Rome was just one town. And he dragged his feet, which led to Canina attacking first, and Romulus killing its king, Acron, in single combat. He marched to Canina, he took some of their elite hostages and relocated many people to Rome, and sent Romans over there to essentially colonize parts of it and keep an eye on the Caninians. The same thing happened. So what you're going to get is a back and forth between little skirmishes or battles. Certainly not the wars that history and the records make them out to be, right? These are small populations. And so then the Antemni attacks Rome. They were also defeated. Now, Romulus had a parade inside Rome to display the armor of King Acron. So you can argue whether this was a triumph or not. But the point being is like he basically had a show, and later on the Romans would adopt the triumph as you know, a celebration of vanquishing an important enemy. So he erected a shrine to Jupiter Feretrius and placed the armor there. It's called the Spolia Optima, which is like maximum spoils. And Romulus was one of 3 Roman commanders in Roman history to personally kill the enemy's supreme leader in battle. The other one was Aulus Cornelius Cossus. He slew Veii king Lars Tolumnius. Incidentally, Lars seems to be a title, kind of like big man, Latus, in the Etruscan language. And Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who killed Britomartis, was I think it was some sort of Germanic leader, Germanic tribe leader. And it is important to note that Livy claims that the triumph originated with Tarquinius Priscus, who was a king from he ruled Rome, but obviously his name Tarquinius. He came from Tarquinia, which is an Etruscan city, one of the most powerful ones, along with Veii. But that's a separate conversation. Anyway, so he marched to Antemni, he took hostages, he followed the same playbook. He also defeated the Customarians, he followed the same playbook. This had the effect of growing Rome's reputation and attracting more immigrants, and Romulus helped increase that by promising free land. And this also had the effect of having smaller villages submit to Rome in anticipation, you know, to preempt any sort of Roman aggression. At this point, the Sabines are getting concerned because they had not expected Rome to win, and now Romulus is stronger than ever, which puts them in a not great position. Titus Tatius, the king of Cures, went around the other Sabine towns, and he raised around 25,000 Sabine men and 1,000 horse. These numbers are exaggerated because the population simply could not support that kind of an army. But the point being, it's like when the Greeks, the 300 killed 1 million or fought 1 million Persians. It's meant to say a lot. So he raised a lot of soldiers for that time. Rome did as well, and they went to, and then the Sabines invaded Rome. But Romulus was prepared. He had defenses. He built forts in the Capitoline and Palatine hills. This is where you get the legend of Tarpeia, and then where you get the Tarpeian Rock. Her father, Tarpeius, was the commander of the Capitoline fort, but she betrayed it to Titus Tatius and the Sabines, opening the gates and letting them in, supposedly for what they had on their left arm. Depending on what the interpretation is, this could be the shield that the scutum that the Sabines carried, or their jewelry, like bangles. Either, nobody really knows. Either way, when she surrendered the fort, she was killed by the Sabines in what is a pretty gruesome way. She was either crushed to death by the shields, and also obviously they threw them at her, or by the jewelry that they threw at her. then there were a series of stalemate battles. A lot of men were killed until the Sabine women.
You know, Emilio, I just wanted to maybe emphasize for some people who may not know what Tarpeian rock represented. You know, maybe you want to talk about this. It was a on the southern end rock on the southern end of Capitoline Hill, from where there was a shameful executions happened. It was not a normal execution in the Roman Kingdom, the Republic, that ever happened, but only for someone who particularly emphasizing the shameful death. The regular death execution was by strangulation in Rome, but throwing someone from Tarpeian rock would represent not just a death, but a big shame because of that betrayal of Tarpeia.
In particular for political crimes like treason.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It definitely was not an honorable way to die, if you will. So, so the Tarpeian rock, likely because of obviously what she did, which is betray the Romans. Although there are interpretations that say she was trying to help Romulus, just didn't work out in the way that she planned. Right. So they made an alliance and became dual kings. This is bizarre because Romulus does not have a track record of sharing power, and also it seems a bit odd as to how Titus expected not to be double crossed by someone like Romulus. So anyway, so they become likely maybe the Romans needed Sabine organization, if you will, because they do institute a number of social reforms once the Sabines come into the picture. So the Titus ruled in the Capitoline Hill, Romulus ruled in the Palatine. They united the Senate into one that encompassed both Sabines and Romans. So the Senate goes up to 200, 100 Romans, 100 Sabines. The citizenry were divided into 3 tribes. We don't know what their qualifications were, but it is likely city of origin. So they were the Ramnenses, presumably named after Romulus, the Tatianses after Tatius, and the Lucernenses. This is speculated to be named after, I think it's Lucerno, who was reputed to be one of the big men in Rome. So as Paul said, he likely brought his gang, and he was a significant presence. And each tribe was assigned a tribune who organized the tribes and presented their concerns to the king. And each tribe was subdivided into 10 curiae led by the curiones, and a decurion commanded each subdivision. Then the equestrian order was created. They were non-noble, but eventually would become the merchant class of Rome. Some of them would marry into the patrician class, and some of them would, some later on, some of the patrician class would become equestrian to obtain the money that the equestrian families had. So they passed a lot of laws, mostly patriarchal, but some women had some rights, like divorce was not easy. So the ideal was to have as many children as possible. This is why the Roman laws at this time made it difficult to divorce and expensive. So all right. So then Romulus fathered a daughter, Prima. I don't know if that it means first. So it's who knows. And a son, Aeolus. Okay, and then they set about turning the swampy area between the Capitoline and Palatine and Caelian Quirinial hills into the Roman Forum, and that's the origin of the Roman Forum. They also had employment stations.
I'm sorry. Are you going to talk about the curious that they created? Did you talk about this? Did I miss it?
Not really. I mean, there's a speculation that you get the word citizen from cures, and then there's so how much of it was actually based off the Sabines, and as opposed to the Etruscans, and that's definitely an interesting conversation, but I don't go into that. I mean, if you would like to talk about it, by all means.
Yeah, very briefly. From what I read is that curios were voting blocks. So that's how they would block. There were 30 of them created with the names of supposedly 30 Sabine women who intervened to stop the war between Romulus and Titus. And they actually, it was called Comitia Curiata. So that's just one of the things. And about the three tribes that originally was divided, I think the first one, Ramnes, was Romans, then Sabians, Potatius, and the third one, Luceris, I think it was mostly by ethnic, by Etruscan ethnicity, I think.
Can I comment on this?
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about this at some length when we talk about the kings. But the key, the important things to understand is that these three tribes and the curia were based on clan. They were called genticular. In other words, you were born into a curia. And so they basically reflected an aristocratic organization of the state around the clans. And once again, to the extent that the Roman kings were like tyrants, they essentially had to negotiate power with the aristocracy. And the aristocracy was able to assert certain rights. For example, you mentioned the fact that the religious offices were monopolized by the patricians, by the aristocracy. But so the key here is that these curiae were organized by clan, and I'm going to talk about the reforms of Tullius, of Severus Tullius, who changed it and organized the centuries. But that was the first organization of the state, was into these curiae, clan-based, which means not everybody was related, but they were families that were allied for one reason or another, and you entered one of these tribes purely by virtue of your birth. This will change.
Okay, Emilia, continue.
Yes. Actually, I'm looking forward to that. The King's period is definitely very interesting, because it's where we have more information about Roman practices. Etrurian records, obviously, or records of the archaeological finds, lend more credence and actually build more of a meat and skeleton to what the myths were. We know a lot more about Etruscan practices concretely than like basically the hearsay that we have for Romulus. So that's going to be a very interesting talk. So he had employment delineations, and all this served to basically stabilize Rome and make it more of a town than simply some ragtag collection of people. And we see that this is important throughout history, because we also had a professions list, I believe, in Sumer. So all of this is important. You need to delineate who does what. So we're seeing organizational hierarchy develop for production of goods. So Titus and Romulus this is just a side note, they waged a war against Rome-like town, and by Rome-like I mean it was also filled with undesirable people, supposedly Cameria, former Alba Longans, who were raiding the trade routes and herders of Rome, and then obviously they defeated them and sent Romans in to colonize. In the 6th year of their joint rule, Romulus, again, this is my take on it, he had Titus assassinated. Basically, the story says that Titus was harboring a bunch of Sabines that were pillaging Laurentian flocks and traders. So it's basically like they stole our cattle, we stole theirs, they stole ours, blah, 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 back and forth. The point being, the Laurentians came to Rome and said, hey, one of our people was murdered and Titus is hiding and protecting them. Romulus did nothing. Romulus tried to punish them. Titus protected them. And then eventually when they go to a religious celebration, the Laurentians stabbed Titus to death in retribution for that. This seems a very contrived way, given Romulus's track record, to simply, say that Romulus had him assassinated, as likely he didn't have any more use for the king. So then he made the usual 101. He made a priesthood for him, talked about how amazing a guy he was, and then didn't appoint a successor. And I think that speaks volumes. So once again, power is concentrated solely in Romulus's hands. And this is, I think, this shows that if there was a person like this, that he was not playing well with the elites. Because as Paul said, they're used to exerting their voices and having a real impact on the governing of the city, and that would include the economic life as well, obviously. But if Romulus is doing what he wants without consulting them, this is going to become a very real problem, which it does. Then this is important because Livy writes that Fidenae started trouble with Rome, doing the same usual cattle raiding, et cetera, et cetera. So he invaded and conquered Fidenae and made them a Roman colony. So he confiscated land and distributed it to his subjects. And then, as another side note, the Camerini once again caused trouble, and Romulus defeated them and came home with maybe a second triumph. Either way, it was a parade. And he came with a bronze 4-horse chariot. So maybe it was like the original quadriga. It was placed in the Temple of Vulcan. And then this conquest of Fidenae brings Rome too close to Veii, which is one of the two main Etruscan cities, the other one being Tarquinia. So it's too close for comfort, and Veii is now very aware of the threat that Rome poses. But it was rich, it was extremely well defended, and it looked for an excuse to attack Rome, and it seized on its kinship bonds with the city of Fidenae. They were flimsy. The theory, the speculation is that they said, look, you've seized some citizens of Veii who lived in Fidenae. Perhaps they had married some Fidentes, and therefore, you're crossing the line with Veii, so surrender the city. And obviously, this is an impossible choice. Romulus is not going to do that because Fidenae, was aggressive towards them, and also, why would you do that? So he did not, and hostilities began, and the Veientes invaded Rome, but were defeated comprehensively, and they had large casualties. But it's telling because the records say that Romulus did not press his advantage, and it's because Veii was heavily fortified. The Etruscans were well known for their walls, and so we see that at this time Rome could not, although it could likely defend itself against one city from Veii, from the Etruscan League, it could not go and conquer them and also risk the wrath of the other cities. We're going to see later on that the Romans likely fall afoul of this, and then they say that they weren't, but they were conquered for a while by the Etruscans. So Romulus came and celebrated his victory on October 15th, Ides of October, and Veii was forced to sign a peace treaty, ceding a region named Septimpagium, as well as the salt mines at the mouth of the river. Salt was very important back then. Maybe the origin of the word salario, salary. They also took hostages and engraved the treaty on pillars.
Just a comment on the question of walls, just a comment of what archaeology now shows, which is that the Etruscan cities, by and large, were not walled until the even in as late as the 6th century. Very few, if any, of the Etruscan cities had complete walls. The walls at Tarquini and Caere belong to the 4th century, and the city of Veii had very strong natural defenses and did not build walls until late in the 5th century. So I want to push back on that, and I want to push back on the whole idea that Etruria, that the Etruscans ever ruled at Rome and were an advanced civilization relative to the Romans. I don't think that's the case. I think that the archaeology shows that the material remains of the Etrurian cities and Rome in that period are absolutely indistinguishable from each other. If you come in, you didn't know where it came from, you would not be able to say whether it was an Etrurian city or a Latin city that had been excavated.
Just a thought, we're discussing Romulus and Remus. We're discussing kind of legendary history as opposed to accurate history. I'm assuming that, are we confident that Romulus existed? He's the story the Romans told about themselves.
Well, maybe not Romulus, but there was likely some character or some characters that were then, united into this idea of Romulus. I don't know, maybe Paul has some insight into that.
Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that what you look that what the tradition tells you that's reliable is about institutions. There are some individuals that you might argue were historical. Romulus is certainly not one of them.
Right. So Rome had grown and again expanded to accommodate 50,000 citizens. This number could be exaggerated, but the point being is that the city was now large enough to be a player in the peninsula. Numitor died and left Alba Longa's kingship to Romulus, who promptly refused it. He did give them create the yearly election for the position of Alban leader. This would make sure that no one could be king and amass power over a lifetime. So while essentially giving the people of Alba Longa the ability to choose their own leader. So it was a win-win for Rome. And by this point, Alba Longa is considered to be the subservient partner to Rome. So I mean, everything is murky here, but he clearly, if there was somebody like Romulus, he must have been too drunk on power. If we attribute everything that happened to one person, which is highly unlikely, then this guy basically went from win to win to win to win. So why wouldn't he think he's God's gift to the Romans? So he started snubbing. Well, he didn't start. He continued snubbing the Senate, likely becoming more open about it and more contemptuous, and turned them into his rubber stamp. He didn't consult the elites when making decisions, rather issuing orders to them. He settled the troops on Veii's land without consulting the Senate. We're going to see this actually become a problem later on as well. I forget who the king was, but when he died, he gave the land to the Brutus brothers, I think. No, the Gracchi. When some king gave half his kingdom, I think, to the people of Rome, well, the rich senators are the representatives of the people, and they wanted that land. They didn't need it, but they wanted it. Whereas the Gracchi said, "Oh, hey, we can solve our population issues here," and gave them to the people at large. This obviously resulted in the Gracchi being killed in the same way that today, hey, we're going to raise taxes. That's a problem. So the tipping point likely came when he released Veii's hostages, which were elites, obviously, This did not sit well with the Senate. And then reputedly in July, he called an assembly near the Goat's Marsh on the Campus Martius, which was a field northwest of the Palatine Hill. Senators were there, and then, the story goes that a large storm happened, massive downpour, lots of thunder, lightning, solar eclipse, pretty much everything you can think of. Romulus's guards deserted him, but of course the senators did not. And then later on, after he was murdered, they came back and claimed they saw him ascend to heaven and become a god, later to be Quirinius, supposedly around 55 years old. In all likelihood, if this story were real, we can imagine that he was murdered and his corpse was either chopped up or buried or thrown into the marsh because it was never found. So this does tell us that if this happened, this was planned ahead of time and had a general consensus, because no one protected Romulus, not even his personal guard. I think he had 300 of them. Now, obviously, you want to make sure that once you get rid of the leader, you want to take away any future claimants to the throne. So his widow, likely not believing the story of his ascension to godhood and likely knowing everything that was going on behind the scenes with the senators not being happy with Romulus, probably went around agitating and causing trouble. This has happened before in history, where the widows are like, hey, this is in Rome as well. You killed my husband, you killed this, blah, blah, blah. I forget the Roman general that was killed by an emperor, and then Caligula's father, I think Caligula's father. So she was killed. The official story is that she was transported into heaven as a shooting star swept her up. As we all know, shooting stars are wont to do that. And then the senators, having learned the protocol from Romulus, they paid effusive tribute to her, proclaimed her a goddess named Hora, and then his kids were likely killed as well, as nothing further is written about them. And that is Romulus, and to a much lesser extent, Remus. So that's it, guys.
Let me make a comment about the Senate. We talked about the Senate here. We have to, the Senate, like all of these Roman institutions, changed its nature profoundly during the course of the Roman Republic. At this point in time, at the time of the kings, the Senate had no constitutional function of any kind. It could not pass laws. Nothing that it did was incumbent on anybody. The Senate in these early days was essentially a council of advisors, a concilium, if you will, who would be consulted purely on the whim of the king, and the king was under no obligation to take any account of what they actually said. He might just come to them and announce the decision that he made. And this is kind of, you can actually see the same thing in the same thing functioning as far back as Homer, where the Greeks at Troy form an assembly, but the purpose of the assembly is for the king to come to inform them about the decisions that he's made, and nothing more than that. So that's really what the Senate was at that point in time. And once again, because all of our information about this is from historians who at their oldest are from the Middle Republic, and most of them are from the Late Republic or the early Empire. They don't know anything about these older institutions. So they will, when they start going out into detail, they'll explain the institutions as they understood them. So if you're, if you're Dio or Dionysius, you're saying, well, I know what the Senate, has been for the last 200 years, but you're talking about events that happened 600 years before that. So that's when you look at these historians, in general, when they describe the details of how things functioning, it doesn't really go back much further than the 3rd century.
Just a thought about that. if we look at the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, the Celts and the Germans were all Indo-European Aryan cultures, and typically the social structure was a warrior chief of some sort with a little band of warriors that swept down about 2000 BC and conquered a large chunk of the world. What you had was a leader surrounded by his little band of warriors, and you could, at some point along the line, you come up with a name for them. You can call them the Senate, or you can call them the Sacred Band, or something like that. And typically in Indo-Aryan culture, the leader traces his ancestry back to some god hero. So like the Germans said they were descended from Woden. The Macedonians and the Spartan kings claimed they were descended from Heracles. And I don't know what the Persians claim descent from. That's a pretty logical structure. And what we're looking at here is kind of a mythical story built around, you know, we can be confident that culture existed. What we're looking at is a mythical story. Their own built around it. But I'm fascinated with the fact that the Romans traced their ancestry to a group of vicious bandits.
Let me just comment on one thing. I would take issue with what you said, is that it's not a question of the leader and his followers. What we see here is we had already groups, clan-based aristocratic groups. The king was an outsider who was forced to negotiate with them. So you actually had a dual power type of negotiation. And you can see in all of this, one constant theme is friction between Romulus and the patricians and the senators. So it's not a question here of some Indo-European leader and his followers. It's really a question of small, powerful families, aristocratic groups, and for some reason being forced to accept an outsider as king who had support by the common people. The king in Rome is always associated with the common people up to the point where when the kings are expelled from Rome, it's by aristocrats. It's not by the people.
By the way, if I may point out, you said you don't know where the Persians claim their ancestry from. At least Herodotus, which is a Greek Persian, he has this recites this legend that they actually Astyages is this descendant of king of Athens, Aegeus, and Medea, who, if you remember, she killed the children from Jason. She came to Athens and married King Aegeus, and they had a son, Medus. And when Theseus arrived, she tried to poison him, and she was expelled with her son. She moved to the east, and supposedly Medus gave the origin of the Medes, the tribe of Medes, and the king of Medes, eventually Astyages, was the grandfather of Cyrus the Great. I mean, this is all mythology, and this is a Greek kind of version of it. But I thought
it's interesting. But what's the story? The Persians must have the Persian leaders must have had some story about their ancestry that made them look good.
They just didn't write about it. Well, of course, they called Achaemenid dynasty, and there was a king, Achaemenid, which was Persian king. I think it goes from Cyrus's father, Cambyses. I think it was his great grandfather or something. And then there is another Darius, who was not supposedly related to Cyrus, but he also concocted the descendants from Achaemenid from a different kind of line. So that's there to the Achaemenid. That's their version, but they didn't write about that.
And this is a great example about what I was saying about the tradition of Greek historiography, right? You see in this story, first of all, Herodotus, by definition, is the father of history, and he's the father of Greek historiography. And what the Greeks do as I said, is they systematize these stories and they make them Greek-centric. So there's descent from Athens, and they find the origin of all these other people, the Medes and so forth and so on. And the Greeks, they put together a logical story that makes a consistent, coherent narrative, and they put pressure on other people to kind of match them, which is kind of the origin of some of the Roman stories. But these are Greek stories, they're not Persian stories.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm sorry I took you to the side on this story, but well, let's go back to this Roman mythology, as we call it. Any other comments?
Well, my understanding.
I'm sorry. Go on.
My understanding here is that the way to understand Rome in these early days is that it was a big ethnic mix. So yes, you had Etruscans, and you also had Sabines, and you also had Latins, and you had people who were supposedly have Greek ancestry, and so forth. And so the fact that there were two kings who were had Etruscan names and Etruscan ethnicity says nothing about Etruscan rule in Rome. It just shows that the society of Rome was very mixed and very diverse, and people had power and influence from many different ethnic backgrounds. There is no evidence really that there was Etruscan rule at Rome, or even that there was major Etruscan cultural influence at Rome. The main cultural influence here were the Greeks. Once again, it was the Greeks that introduced the personification of individuals in religion, in gods, right? Personified people. It was the Greeks that introduced the forms of warfare that were adopted by the Romans and the Etrurians, which is to say the hoplite panoply and hoplite warfare, which was kind of the basis of all the military aspects here. And ultimately, the idea of the formation of a city-state, it came from the Greeks, and the Greeks directly influenced the Romans and the Etruscans. The Romans did not have to get it secondhand through the Etruscans. They got it firsthand from the Greeks.
Well, I think that there's merit to that statement. Before the Romans existed properly, the Etruscan city-states had contact with the Greeks, and in fact, their civilization seems to be a derivative of essentially Greeks, like their gods like Tinia, or even eventually the military formation they adopted, the phalanx. But if we look at where Rome was located, it was surrounded by the much older Etruscan civilization, which had by that point in time already been affected, influenced by the even older Greek civilization.
I don't know why do you say that? Why do you say that the Etruscans were older? It's not proven by the archaeology at all.
Older than what? The Romans?
Older than the Romans.
Yes, I mean this was very popular among scholars, 50 years ago, but it's no longer taken as an assumption by modern researchers.
Well, just to put a little geographic slant on it, for those who don't see the map, but if you can imagine the peninsula, the Apennine Peninsula, what we call Italy, and you know where the Rome is. So the Tiber River goes to the southwest of Rome and falls into the Tyrrhenian Sea. At the mouth of it was called Ostia, which is Ostia Antica. Also, port was founded very, very long time ago, at least to the 7th century, maybe even 9th. And Lavinium is almost on the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea, which is directly south of Rome, and then Alba Longa would be probably just east of Rome in the mountain there, and the small. Oh,
Good,
you
good.
got it. Oh no, but you don't see. And they show that Etruscans was to the north. These are all Etruscan cities, but I was talking about Latins south. So you see where the Rome is. You can imagine where Ostia is probably southwest. Then you go directly south of Rome to Tyrrhenian Sea. That's where the Lavinium was, and the Alba Longa was somewhat southwest, probably more west than south from Rome. And Veii is the typical, close Etruscan city, and of course many others. They don't show everything here, but it's a very famous map.
So you see that Rome was not surrounded by the Etruscans. Rome was on the border.
On the border, Rome was on the border. Etruscans were to the north,
the actual physical situation of Rome is that the Tiber has a bend right where Rome is, which means that the water in the river slows down, and that is the only fordable area of the Tiber. That's the first fordable area of the Tiber when you move up from the coastline. Okay. And Rome was established on hills on the southern shore of the Tiber, which is to say naturally defensible positions overlooking the only north-south passageway from between Italy, between the sea and the mountains at the place where the Tiber River is. So it was an immensely strategical, strong, defensible position.
And by the way, you see the down south, the name Campania. And if you look, there are two islands there. One, the white one, one, the bigger one. This is the Ischia. This is the islands where the first Greek colony was there in the 8th century BC. And the other one is a Capri, by the way. We talked about this in the beginning. So these are two very famous islands. And of course, in this is the Bay of Naples.
Right. And the tip right next to the island of Ischia would be where the Greek city of Cumae was founded.
Yes, that's right. Cumae,
and if anything, this was the original source, the original root of the cultural transformation of both Etruria and Latium, coming from basically Euboean settlers, the Euboean Greeks from the island of Ischia.
Right, and I agree with you that Greeks probably play a dominant role in influence on Rome, but I'm sure that Etruscans played some role, being the neighbors and.
Well, certainly they did. I'm not saying there was no role. I'm just saying that it was not a dominant role.
Right.
You know, the Etruscans were influential at Rome, and Romans, I'm sure, were dispersed and had influence in Etruria. This was there was ethnic mixing going on here. And especially in Rome, that was sitting there right at the border.
Yeah, and that's why we were talking about this three original tribes with probably three dominant ethnic, you could say, tribal things, because the Romans, Sabines, and Etruscans, they all played part as an ethnic group.
And the question of the founding of Rome is related to when the settlements on these individual hills formed a political alliance, became a single political unit. That's when you have the city of Rome, the polis of Rome, if you will.
Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, Paul. Do you have a book in mind when you say that?
Yes.
Rome and the Etruscans had similar levels of advancement at the time?
It's called The Beginnings of Rome by T.J. Cornell. And I'll be showing pictures of this, in my presentations. T.J. Cornell, The Beginnings of Rome, is a really kind of a remarkable book.
Thank you. I'll definitely have to check it out. Cool. All right. Well, I think this was really, really good, guys.
Yeah, thank you for
Yes,
pulling
thank
all this
you.
stuff together. I mean, it is the basis for studying Rome, is to know these early legends.
Thank you,
That was
Emilio.
good.
Thank you, guys.
Okay,
Thank
thanks, Amelia. Great.
Again, thank you guys. I learned a lot.
Mhm.
All right. Well, take care, guys. I'm up.
Sure. All right. So I don't know, is Zach still here? You wanna say anything? Where is Zach?
I'm here, but I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody. Thank Emilio. Thanks for Paul and Greg for fruitful and constructive comments. Appreciate it. So next week, please sign up for How the Aristotle Got to the Western World. And Anne is going to present that on Thursday at 7. And on Sunday, we have another good presentation about Americas. And please look at the schedule, and Sergio presenting that. So without further ado, I'm going to let everybody have the rest of a long Memorial weekend. Have a nice holidays, guys.
Just wanted
Thank
to
you
add
very
that the first Kings of Rome, Paul and I will present together on June 12th. Okay.
June 12th, correct.
2
yes.
weeks from today, yeah.
2 weeks from today. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna let everyone go then. Have a nice
Take care.
weekend.
Yeah,
Take care.
bye-bye. Thanks.
Take care. And thank you.